So today should be not our last Sunday school, but our last in this section on world order. We talked about worldview, Christian worldview, and we talked about definitions. We talked about the fear of the Lord, our Proverbs project. We talked about knowing God, and we're finishing up world order. And then the next section will start, Lord willing, next week. I will be gone 1 or 2 weeks in Morris coming up here. Thanksgiving weekend for sure. And I have to double check the 19th because now I'm wondering if I misunderstood that he said or he said and. I'm like, did he say or? I don't remember. I might have misunderstood. So anyway, it might be a couple weeks around Thanksgiving, but Thanksgiving weekend for sure. The imagination section will be relatively short compared to the other ones. So we've been talking about world order. So just by way of review, this definition has been our working definition. We tweaked it a little bit as we've gone through. But a worldview definition is all the beliefs one has that affects how one lives in the world. And beliefs is asterisk because it's all these things in the bullets. Everything we know to be true, everything we do that is right, and everything that we feel. And we've talked a little bit about these noble affections, and we'll talk about it in some detail today, how that plays into it. But the idea of a worldview, or any worldview, is, just by way of review, is it's all the things that we don't think about that allow us to work in the world, or allows us to live in the world around us. You know, we assume certain things to be true. I was listening to a podcast yesterday where the person was talking about driving in Mexico and how difficult it is to drive in Mexico. And I had a friend who lived in Colombia, South America for a while, and he tried to drive in Colombia. He had a license. He drove for a while. He eventually had a car accident, and then he didn't drive again after that by his own choice. And it was just too difficult. But he was telling me, he said, one of the reasons we find it difficult in America to drive in a place like South America and Colombia was we have a different view of the world and especially spatial relationships. So in a room this size, we can say, well, a room this size seats, I don't know how many we seat, 200. Well, I'll make up a number. And then I always say, well, 200 Americans. You have 200 Norwegian Americans. Maybe it's only 100 Norwegian Americans, right? Because the spatial relationships, you know, we have great divides, even between married couples. We have larger divides between father and son. You know, we have all this space, and in South America, their spatial relationships are much closer. And this friend of mine was telling me they even drive that way, and he said they understand that. You know, the turning and driving and spatial relationships between cars, but it makes us nervous, and so we do something stupid, and then we cause the accident. The Americans cause the accident. And he said, because we don't see things the same way. So it's everything that we think about or we don't think about that allows us to live in the world a certain way. You go hunting, you're assuming that, you know, someone's not going to shoot you, but if you hear bullets flying over your head, that's a little disconcerting, right? Things like that. So you assume things are going to work a certain way, and that's how we live. So the Christian worldview then is how do Christians live in the world. And we talked about culture and how culture is the working out. If you have a group of people together and they live out their worldview, they have a shared worldview that looks like culture. So then we talked about this, I hear bird singing, and the fact that this is difficult for us to understand, the sentence. It's probably harder for you to understand now that I've talked about it. But that there's something in our mind that translates the sound that a bird makes to the statement, I hear a bird singing. Similar to the way a radio tuner works. and I use that analogy. There's a lot of sensations coming at us. We're seeing things, we're hearing things, we're feeling things, we're smelling things, hopefully not too much, and hopefully not tasting too much. But all of our senses are bombarded all of the time. And there's something inside of us that helps tune those things so that we can concentrate, we can understand, we can focus on what's important and not focus on what's not important. Those types of things. So then we also talked about how as a person, there's two parts to us, right? There's a material part to us, or a physical part to us, and then there's a spiritual or immaterial part to us. And humans are made up of both. We have both a physical body, we have an immaterial body. We aren't one and another thing added to it, but we are two things put together, and those two things interact with each other. So if you're sad, you might not feel like eating, you have no appetite. Well, sadness is not a physical thing, sadness is an immaterial thing, but you've lost your appetite. So how does that work? The physical side of you is not food. Those things interact with each other. And then we talked about some of that immaterial part, the mind, the heart, and the belly. And what we're going to talk about today is the heart, which is why I'm just redoing this slide here. What we call our affections, or the way, the noble affections, the affections, but it really has to do with how we love. And that's what we want to talk about today. Because, I guess I have it farther down. I think I'm out of order on this slide. Okay. So we talked about this worldview. Truth is up above in God, and God has created the universe in such a way that there's truth down here. He's created us, the little people, with us that we have, because we're made in the image of God. We know certain things to be true from the day we're born. Like Pastor mentioned today, we know from the day we're born, we know how to sin. Okay, we are born with that knowledge. We are born with the knowledge that we should not sin. We're born with that knowledge too, which is why from the smallest ages, you have children who try to hide their sin from their parents. They're just not very skilled at it, as we are, to do that. So they often get caught. And we talked a couple weeks on how God has ordered the world, and one of the ways God has ordered the world is by words. He's used language to order the world, and that's one of the things we see. Adam was created with the ability to know and understand and to speak, to name animals, to have a conversation with God. He was born with all of that. And small children learn how to speak, they learn how to read, they learn how to write, and this is something that God has given to us as a way by which to order the world. Obviously, the languages get confused at the Tower of Babel, but all of the languages have this ability. To a lesser or greater extent, some languages are better at communicating than others. We can debate whether Spanish is better than English. Some would debate that Spanish is better than English. We ran into this in Papua New Guinea because the language there had so few words, it was very difficult to communicate. Complicated, or sometimes when we're talking about theology or doctrine, they just didn't have the words. So you had to make up words, which was hard to do. Okay, so we talked about words, language, God has ordered the world. The other one that I mentioned that is through loves. So that's what we want to talk about today, and I think we can get through this today, is what are we talking about when we're talking about God ordered the world through loves? Okay, so here are a couple of passages that I'd like us to talk about. And it says love and hate at the top, but I didn't get to the hate passage. I don't think I did. I shouldn't speak so quickly. Maybe I did. All right, so Deuteronomy 6 is perhaps one of the most important passages in studying God in the Bible, who He is. It's one of the most important passages to those of the Jewish faith. It's called the Great Shema, that's what it's called in English, because the first word here, in 6:4, Hear, O Israel, is the Hebrew word Shema. In fact, in the Hebrew text, I could have shown it to you, it's kind of like writing the first word of the sentence in all capitals and the last word of the sentence in all capitals, kind of like that, or having this bigger font. They kind of set it out, set it apart in this passage. But Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 6 says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. And then he goes on to talk about teaching them to your children in all situations of life. So this is the great commandment. And we'll come back to that in Matthew 22, when the Pharisees come to Jesus and say, what's the greatest commandment? There's approximately 617 commandments in the Old Testament. And so the Pharisees were trying to trick Jesus and say, which one's more important than all the other ones? Well, Jesus said, this one is the most important one. And he quotes from Deuteronomy 6:5. Then Leviticus 19, which might seem like an odd reference. When you think of Leviticus, you think of a lot of strange laws, and most people don't spend their devotional time reading out of the book of Leviticus. In fact, Pastor sent me a text on Friday. He was at a bookstore, and a used bookstore, and said, they have a commentary, it's volume 1 of 3, they just had the first volume, on the book of Leviticus, and it's only $20. Should I buy it? Well, I didn't see his text message, so he brought it up this morning. Oh, by the way, did you see my text message? I didn't buy it. Should I pay $20 for it? And he said, well, then I was thinking, when am I going to need a commentary this thorough, it's volume 1 of 3, on the book of Leviticus? When am I going to need a commentary that thorough on Leviticus? And I said, if you ever need a commentary that thorough on the book of Leviticus, ask me. So I have a lot of commentaries on Leviticus because I wrote my dissertation on Leviticus. So I said, no, just let me know, you can borrow them. And that settled that. But he's like, maybe I should have. But Leviticus 19, in verse 18, it's an interesting passage. I don't know that I preached it here before, but I have preached it before. But in verse 18, actually verse 17, he says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. That verse is actually preached pretty well. Verse 18 says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, and Jesus in Matthew 22 says that this is the second great commandment, and he quotes here from Leviticus 19:18. And Jesus says, all of the laws in the Old Testament, all 600 some, hang on these two. If you can do these two, then you don't have to worry about any of the other laws in the Old Testament. You will fulfill them. If you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might, and if you love your neighbor as yourself. Now, the Deuteronomy 10 passage, I find this passage just to be quite fascinating. Deuteronomy 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, Moses is rehearsing to the new generation. So remember, I was thinking about this when I was getting ready for Sunday school. Pastor just preached on the old generation that died in the wilderness. And then he talked about the new generation that was successful in going in and conquering the land. In Deuteronomy, the early chapters of Deuteronomy, Moses is talking to that second generation. And he's rehearsing all of the bad things that their parents did. Okay, so he's just come off the story of the golden calf, where they sinned from the book of Exodus. He's talking about needing a second set of the Ten Commandments, and Moses has to go up and get a second set of the Ten Commandments because the people of Israel were sinning. So then in verse 12, and this passage actually runs into chapter 11, and there's parts of chapter 11 we could look at too, but we won't for sake of time. But chapter 10, verse 12 says, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord require of you?" So Moses is saying, just told them, remember, I went up and got a second set of the Ten Commandments. Okay? So now, second generation, what does the Lord require of you? So it's kind of like teaching a Sunday school class. Right, kids? Now they're all over 20 years of age, but right, kids? Okay. What does the Lord require of you? To keep the Ten Commandments? No. What does the Lord require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul. And then in verse 13 he says, and to keep the commandments and the statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. For your good. These commandments are for your good. But the emphasis is on loving the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. That's the emphasis. If the first generation had done that, there would be no need for a second set of 10 commandments, because they would not have fallen into idolatry so quickly. Now, verse 14, behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heavens of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them. People he's talking to, you above all peoples as you are this day. So God had an affection for the people of Israel. And we know from the Old Testament, not because they were special, not because they did anything to deserve his love, but he set his heart on them. So this relationship, the covenant relationship between Israel and the Lord, and I've said this before, we looked at it in Exodus, is I will be your God and you shall be my people. And it's very similar to a marriage vow, right? That I will be your husband and you shall be my wife. And that's the similar language that we're using here. So this focus is on God loving his people and his people loving him. And of course, this is directly brought into us as his people in the New Testament in our love for him. In Ephesians 1, Paul says basically the same thing. That just read that verse real quickly. Ephesians 1. Starting in verse 4. Even as he chose us, God the Father chose us in him, the Son, before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has blessed us in the beloved. So, God's saving us is on account of God's love for us. Romans 5. While we were still sinners, God showed his love for us. God showed his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So, our relationship to God is very similar. It's based on love. So, how do we think about this idea of love? Well, first we have to distinguish the word love in English is kind of, it can mean multiple things. Okay? So we have to kind of start there. What do we mean by the word love? Well, how many ways do you think of using the word love in English? I said, how many of you love pizza? Did you raise your hand? Did you say, yeah, I love pizza? Especially we don't have any single men in this room. Okay. I love pizza.
certain types of pizza.
Okay, certain types of pizza. Maybe not, you don't love sardines on your pizza?
No.
No. Yeah, Paul's not a sardine. You're probably not a vegetable lover's pizza either, very far.
Fruit.
No fruit or vegetables on your pizza. That's the other side. No, I hate vegetables on your pizza. Okay, well, how about a good hunting dog? Now, a lot of you hunt, but does anybody in here have hunting dogs?
Doug used to.
Doug used to have hunting dogs? Or we have fishing?
Zach used to. Yes. Zach.
Zach has some hunting dogs? I have a lot of coworkers who have hunting dogs. So they talk a lot about their hunting dogs. So you might love a good hunting dog. You might say, well, I love a good shotgun. You know, I can shoot really well with John's shotgun, because John is a good shotgun. It's more to do with his gun than it has to do with my skill. You might have a good hunting dog that you love. I have 2 daughters. I always say that I love my daughters, equally. I have a wife, so I love my wife.
One way.
Yeah, just one, that's singular. Okay. I won't get to the other one. So, when we talk about that, we use the word for love for all of these. Hopefully, it is an obvious distinction that what I mean by that is not the same. Okay? If I love my hunting dog more than I love my wife, would that be a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah.
Right? This isn't a country western song. Okay? How's it go? My wife said it's near for the dog, and well, I'm gonna miss her. Okay. So it's not it's illusion, that's wrong. If I say that I love my daughters as much as I love my wife, well, that also would be wrong, right? That I shouldn't love my daughters in the same way I love my wife. We'd say that there's a problem. I hope you would say that there's a problem. So we love things to a different degree. There's degrees of love or types of love when we're talking about loving people, loving things, whatever it might be. Okay, so how do we translate this? So here are some big words. So sentiment is loving what God loves to the degree that God loves it. Okay, to the same degree that God loves it. God has ordered the world in such a way that He loves certain things to a certain degree. He loves humankind more than, for example, He loves creatures that He made, right? Because we're made in His image. Christ came and died for us. He didn't come and die for elephants. Okay? We don't have services where we have animals blessed in our services, by the pastor. I don't think we do. Not since we've been here anyway. But there are some churches that do that, bring your pet for a blessing. Okay, we don't do that because God doesn't ordain that. There's a difference in that. So God has certain degrees with which He loves and doesn't love. God hates certain things as well. God hates sin. There is a verse in Psalms where God hates the sinner. Actually, it states that God hates the sinner who is doing the sin. And that's a tough verse for us to get our minds around. But there are certain things that God hates. There are certain things that God loves. God loves righteousness. We can read this as we go through the scriptures. God loves holiness. God loves righteousness. God loves His Son. God loves, us, even though while we're yet sinners, Christ died for us. So there are certain things that God loves, and He loves to a certain degree. What happens if we love something not enough? Not as much as we should love it. Well, the word for that is called brutality. And that makes sense if you think about it. If I don't love my wife as much as I should love her, well, how much should I love my wife? Well, Ephesians 5 tells me how much I should love my wife. says, men, love your wives, and give yourself for her like Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. So we're taught and we're given an example of what our love should look like for our wives. And if my love is any less than that, then I am being a brute, I'm being like an animal. Okay, that's the idea of that brutality. I'm just behaving like an animal. Then in that case. So, and then it's easy for us to do things like this. We should love the assembly. We should love assembling with the believers and worshiping God. And if we don't love that enough, then we are not loving it the way God would have us to love it. And then the last one is sentimentality. Sentimentality is loving something too much. So, and here we probably see this sometimes in certain cases, right? And this is using the example of an animal. We'll see people who will say this about them. I don't know if this is true of anyone here, so I'm not picking on anyone intentionally. But we'll say, oh, they don't have children, they have animals. And they love their animals as much as they would love their children. And we say, well, that seems odd, you know. But sometimes we see that happen. Or we can love a child too much and dote on them. So when they whine, then we give them whatever they want. And we show that sentimentality, we love them too much. A great example of sentimentality, and I was going to use this later. I can still use it later. But my mom, so my mother likes to watch a couple old mysteries on television, some old shows that were popular a long time ago. Well, now that it's November, she can't watch those shows because it's the Hallmark Christmas Movie Festival. Has now taken over. You don't sound excited about that, Paul. You know, so the Hallmark Christmas Movie Marathon, which is now, I think, up to like 9 months, and then they do it again in the summer, you know, like Christmas in July. Okay, so a friend of ours that, you know, posted a thing about this, you know, it's like, you know, what has 3 writers, 4 actors, 1 plot, you know, and 75, I said sweaters, but you said it was flannel shirts. Flannel shirts, yeah, 75 flannel shirts. You know, it's the Hallmark movies. So what is it about the Hallmark Christmas movies? I don't even know. I think if I've seen a commercial for one, I've seen them all, right? You know, like, do you have to sit down and watch the whole thing? They're like, yes, you do. Yeah.
She gets mad because I tell her how it ends.
When it's just started, he knows how it's gonna end, and it just ruins the whole show.
Way to go, Daryl.
If you need to have some marriage counseling afterwards, Daryl, we can talk about it. But these warm, fuzzy movies, you know, that's what they're designed to do, is give you warm, fuzzy movies. But more often than not, the movie is giving a sense of being in love with being in love more than being in love with the person, right? So young men fall into this trap all the time. We've tried to warn them, right? Us older men who fell into this trap ourselves. We say, when you go off to college, don't get a girlfriend your first year. Don't do it. Just don't. And then they do. And then why? And then they break up with the boy and he gets all sad and I'm like, yay! You know, nothing better can happen. But a lot of times young men are more interested in being in love than they are actually loving the person that they're with. That's the point of sentimentality. You're more interested in being in love than the person you're with. And it's actually loving the person you're with. You're just more interested in the feeling. So that idea of sentimentality is it's been around for a while. There's authors, old authors. What's the one you don't like? Dickens, thank you. Dickens was big on sentimentality. And so he's been around for a while. He's been dead for a while. So, sentimentality. So these three. So what we have to, if this is the case, I think it is. If this is the case that God has ordered the world through loves, and God has communicated much of this to us, but some of it is things, again, that, like language, we have to figure out in the world around us. Then the question is, how do we order our loves in such a way that they match how God loves things in the world? And some of these things we know very, very well. Wives and husbands, children, our relationship to God, those types of things we know are of great importance to God and should be of great importance to us. But we have to get those things right. And that helps us in understanding the world around us. What is our response to or reaction to sin? How much of it do we tolerate? Well, it's a small thing. So I tolerate it, and then it begins to grow into something worse. Well, and then we tolerate it. Well, but it's not as, it could be worse, and what will happen? It'll get worse, right? Then it'll continue to creep and to grow, but because we never had the proper sentiment for it in the first place. We never said, that is evil, and I don't want it to be any part of my life. I want that to stay there. Just like God thinks of sin. So there's two sides to it of loves. Okay, so questions. We have a few minutes for questions. And I know you've all been up an extra hour today, so you're ready for your afternoon nap. But
I never thought of brutality that way.
So brutality is loving less than what we should. How do
Well, mostly it's more of a physical thing, or something of being harmful to somebody.
So when we think of brutality, we think of being physically harmful to someone. And which is true, and that's where the concept comes from. This is the idea of we're acting no more than an animal would act. So I've mentioned this before, when my wife's cat begs for food and then whines, and then you feed her, she doesn't say thank you, right? She's simply hungry and wants to eat, and that's it. And whenever she feels like she's hungry, she eats, and that's it. She just asks